turn my mic on there. Well, it is close, but I think that my favorite book in the Bible is Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. Because in this book, God's love and kind of real everyday humanness meet in a really interesting ways. So what this letter is what's happening in this letter, right, is that Paul is a missionary. He had a profound experience of the risen Christ and decided to be a missionary and spread the love of God around. So he went all around what is now Greece and Turkey, preaching and baptizing folks and helping to start Christian communities. And one of the places he went to was Corinth, a city in Greece, a kind of a large multicultural city on the shoreline. So people from all around the Mediterranean would go there and live there. And while he was in Corinth, it seems that Paul helped to start a Christian community there. And so he stayed there baptizing and teaching and nurturing the community for a while, helping it to start and to grow. And then Paul left, saying, many blessings, y'all keep in touch, and went to another city, another place to start to do missionary work elsewhere. But after Paul had left Corinth, he got word that there was some trouble back in the Christian community at Corinth, and so he wrote a letter to that community. And that letter is what we have in the Bible. And a selection from that letter is what Trudy read earlier in the service. And there's a wonderful mystery in this reading that Trudy read for us that I love thinking about. And it has to do with how Paul, after he had left Corinth, how Paul got word that there was trouble back in the Christian community in Corinth. What Paul writes that we heard earlier today is, for it has been reported to me by Chloe's people that there are quarrels among you, my brothers and sisters. Chloe's people. And Paul clearly expected that the people who would receive this letter would know who Chloe and her people are. But we don't. This is the only time in the whole Bible we hear about Chloe and her people. So there's this fascinating mystery. Who is Chloe and who are her people? There are some wonderful theories. One theory is that Chloe was a wealthy and maybe well-known person who lived in Corinth, and that maybe she and maybe her servants converted to Christianity. And then after Paul left Corinth, Chloe sent her servants to tell Paul things are kind of getting a little haywire over there. A variation of this theory that's interesting is that maybe Chloe did not convert to Christianity, but some of her servants did. And so then maybe even without Chloe's permission, they went and told Paul that things were not going well in Corinth. Another theory, and I think this is probably my favorite theory, is that Chloe was the leader of a house church. So, right, when Paul went around starting Christian communities, they did not have big church buildings, right? And so scholars think there's a really good chance that these Christian communities met to worship in people's homes. And so maybe when Paul went to Corinth to help found the Corinthian church, several people would host worship in their homes, and maybe one of them was Chloe, and maybe her people were the people who worshiped at Chloe's house. And then when things got a little wonky in Corinth, those people went to find Paul. So I love thinking about this mystery, partly because I love reading a mystery novel or watching an episode of television where there's a mystery. But I also love this mystery because whoever Chloe and her people are, behind them you can see real people with hopes and fears, just doing their best to be part of a real Christian community. And I think I also see kind of a human realness in the nature of the problem that Chloe's people report to Paul. What seems to be happening is that the Christian community in Corinth has kind of been dividing, and each of them kind of identifying with a different missionary. So it seems as though Paul was not the only missionary to go to Corinth. We also hear in the letter about other missionaries named Apollos and Cephas, who'd also gone to Corinth. And evidently, according to Chloe's people, different people started to identify with different missionaries. So some of the Christians would say, Paul is the best. We're all about Paul. Other people would say, we're all about Apollos. And other people would say, we're all about Cephas. Which, again, sounds like a really human situation to be in a church. And it reminds me, like right now, these days, we have Methodists, Presbyterians, Baptists, Catholics, and we Episcopalians get along really well with some of these denominations, and maybe not quite always so well with others. Or if you've been around a church for a long time, you've probably also seen conflict inside a church community, right? We're human beings, right? We have conflict, and in that sense, it's kind of comforting to know that we have that in common with the Corinthian church almost 2,000 years ago. But upon hearing this news about the conflict in Corinth, Paul has some really wise and godly wisdom to share with the Corinthian community. He says, well, it's not really about me or Apollos or Cephas or any of us missionaries. We're just laying the groundwork. It's about God, right? Which is a really good message. But what I think is also really cool is that Paul was able to share this deeply wise, deeply divine message, inspired, I think, by God, even though Paul himself was also kind of a mess a lot of the time, I think, rather like the community of Corinthian Christians. You could kind of go on about the ways Paul was a little bit of a mess. If you read Paul's letters, it kind of seems as though he maybe struggled with anxiety, maybe with anger. At one point in another one of his letters, Paul writes that for a long time he's been dealing with, quote, a thorn in my flesh. We don't know what that means. It sounds like it could be some difficulty with maybe chronic pain or with sexuality or maybe with mental health, but we don't know. But it helps make clear that, like all of us, Paul was going through some stuff, right? And also, I think it's actually kind of encouraging that Paul was able to share these really wise words about how to deal with conflict, even though Paul himself sometimes really struggled with conflict. It seems as though for a while, Paul and another missionary named Barnabas were best buds. They were the missionary A-team. They would go all around sharing the gospel, but then they had some kind of big falling out, and they stopped. So that's one conflict. Also, in another one of his letters, Paul writes about a conflict he had with Cephas, that other missionary, and apparently this conflict got so heated that, according to Paul's words, I opposed him to his face. So Paul is kind of a mess, like all of us, but God still called him and enabled him to share all the wonderful words we heard this morning and elsewhere in his letter. And I think it's not just that Paul kind of deals with bigger problems like all of us do. I think, I at least in this passage, I kind of see somebody who is imperfect in really minute, small, and kind of endearing ways. So in the second half of today's reading, Paul is saying that he is glad that he only baptized maybe a couple people in the Corinthian community, because he's thinking, well, maybe if I'd baptized more people, then more people would say, we're all about Paul. When, of course, Paul is trying to get them to see it's all about Christ. I'm not that important. So he's saying that I'm glad I only baptized a couple people. But the way he words it is kind of interesting. He says, I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, so that no one can say you were baptized in my name. And then, parentheses, I did baptize also the household of Stephanas. Beyond that, I do not know whether I baptized anyone else. So you'd think that if he baptized Gaius, Crispus, and the household of Stephanas, he would just write one sentence with a couple commas. He didn't use commas. That's not how they wrote back then. But instead, he writes this in two sentences, which is sort of odd. And we don't know exactly why he did that. But I like to think it has to do with how Paul wrote his letters. So scholars think that Paul almost certainly dictated most of his letters. He didn't, write it down. He would just sit there and say it while somebody next to him wrote it down. So I like to think that Paul at first didn't remember everyone he'd baptized. So maybe as he was dictating, he said, well, I baptized Crispus and Gaius, and blah, 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 blah. Oh, and I also baptized the household of Stephanas, and I don't think I baptized anybody else, I'm not sure. So just kind of a really small but very human thing, where Paul it takes a minute for Paul to remember the people he'd baptized, right? If this were a term paper, Paul would have cleaned that up and made maybe a single sentence out of it. But it's not. He didn't. And so we get this delightfully little, very small, perhaps imperfection in the text. And yet the church affirms that this is Scripture, inspired by God, because God does not ask us to be perfect. Right? The Christian community at Corinth was an imperfect and messy community, but one that God still called to follow in the way of God's love. And Paul is a messy and imperfect person whom Jesus nonetheless called to follow in the way of God's love and to build up and encourage communities like the church in Corinth. And in the same way, we here today, in here and online, perhaps more online than usual with this interesting weather, we are all a messy and imperfect community that God nonetheless loves deeply and calls to follow in the way of God's love. And I would also say that, like Paul, we are also all leaders in the church. And just because we're kind of a mess and imperfect, God still loves us deeply and calls us to follow in the way of God. That doesn't mean we can't stand to do things to be more healthy. Maybe Paul could have benefited from going to therapy. But that doesn't mean we have to have our stuff all together. We don't have to be perfect before we can do God's work. We can do it now, and we do it now. Right? In our gospel today, this kind of famous scene where Jesus calls the first disciples. He says, "Follow me, and I will make you fish for people." He does not say, "Follow me and be perfect." Amen.